Good morning. Welcome to Catalyst. So today we are in our final installment on a 6-part series that we've been on. This is part 6 of 6 called Don't Settle. And what we've been talking about is not settling for what is safe or easy over what is risky or costly. And in message 1, the very first week, we started out with the topic of not settling for pain without gain. In other words, nobody wants to work out and get sore muscles and then have some kind of benefit from that soreness. And so we said that in the midst of trials and tests, sort of like this pandemic we're in, we should be moving forward to something better at the end of it. In other words, we shouldn't be going back to the old normal, but rather to a new normal in which we are better for what we've gone through. And in week 2, we talked about the difference between reacting and responding. And we said, don't settle for reacting. And in our lives, we so easily settle for blowing up or reacting to a circumstance. But what we said is to hit the pause button, to hit the divine pause button if you're a Jesus follower, and to stop and ask God, how should I respond? How can I use my superpower to make a decision, my superpower of decision making, to stop and ask God, how do I respond to this situation instead of reacting? And in week 3, we talked about the difference between anger and holding on to anger versus forgiveness. And we said that just like Paul said in Ephesians 4, that we need to not let the sun go down on our anger. And I don't think Paul was talking about just a day or you should stay up all night to get rid of anger. I think he was talking about that we should be willing to not carry anger into another season of our life, to not hold on to it. In fact, in Ephesians 4, he basically says you need to get rid of it. You need to get rid of it so you don't give the enemy, Satan himself, a foothold in your life. And in week 3, we talked about the danger of autonomy, and we looked at the life of David and how he had such an amazing life and so many victories. But at the age of 50, he began to shelter himself from his closest companions, what we call David's mighty men, the warriors that would go into the field with him. And he didn't go out to battle with them and began to distance himself from their wisdom and from their input into his life. And in the midst of that, he wandered up onto the housetop, up on the housetop of the palace. And when he was there, he looks out and he sees this beautiful married woman by the name of Bathsheba. And the rest is history. I mean, it was really sort of what David is now infamous for. And despite the fact that David did repent and turn back to God, and God forgave him, there were still consequences for what David did. There were still consequences for him trying to live in autonomy, trying to be large and in charge, to be able to make his own decisions and not have anyone else be able to speak into his life. And the conclusion of that message was basically us saying, you know what? We were not created for autonomy. We were created for community. We were created to live in a way that we have our lives open to those who are around us, open to their input, open to and being accountable to their voices in our lives. And if you were here last week, the topic was don't settle for all lives matter. And I was very transparent in saying, you know what, I sort of have. I've sort of said, hey, when I hear someone say Black Lives Matter, when I saw George Floyd's death and the aftermath of some of the protests, I began to say, well, you know what, all lives matter. But that's not enough. And what we said is, what would love require of us? What would love require of us to make sure that Black lives matter so that all lives can matter? And if you were with us, I said maybe 2 good things you could do is, number 1, stop and examine your heart and say, was my heart broken by what happened? Or what was my response? To sort of look inside. And then secondly, I said, well, you should go and you should sit with someone whose skin is a different color. And you should get their perspective. You should see through the lenses, the glasses that they're looking through. And I actually did that. And it had an impact on me. But I'm not going to stop doing that. Because I think ultimately, it's not just about what we think. It's not even just about a protest. It's about how we live our lives and how we take action in our lives. And just so I'm clear, last week was not me endorsing an organization. Last week was me endorsing a way to live. It was endorsing what Jesus gave us, which was to love one another as I have loved you, and to love in such a way that Black lives matter and that therefore all lives matter. And so today, we're going to be on a message entitled, Don't Settle for Christian. And I think I'm going to sort of wade into the messy middle with that title again, but I think you're going to enjoy and I think you're going to benefit from what we have to say. But one thing I want to say before we go to the worship part of our service is I want to say that if you're interested in contributing to Catalyst, and I had a couple of people recently text me, say, how can I contribute? It's very simple. We have an app. It's called the Catalyst Vineyard app, and you can download it from iTunes or Google Play. Just search for Catalyst Vineyard Church. And there's a way that you can give through our app called PushPay. And so if you desire to give to us, you're welcome to do that. And we've had so many generous people supporting us, even during this pandemic. It's been absolutely amazing. But right now, I want maybe as you download that app, and you can also use the app for prayer requests, to look at past messages, to be able to see announcements that we're making. But while you're downloading the app on iTunes or Google Play, Catalyst Vineyard Church, we're going to get ready to enter into worship with Tyler and Hannah.
To the cross I look, to the cross I cling, of its suffering I do drink, of its work I do sing. 'Cause on it my Savior, both bruised and crushed, showed that God is love and God is just. Ooh. And at the cross you beckon me, you draw me gently to my knees, and I am lost for words, so lost in love I am, sweetly broken, holy surrender. What a priceless gift, this undeserved life have I been given through Christ crucified. Yeah, you called me out of death, you called me into life, and I was under your wrath. Now through the cross I'm reconciled. Cross you beckon me, you draw me gently to my knees, and I am lost for words, so lost in love I am, sweetly broken, holy surrender. And at the cross you beckon me, you draw me gently to my knees, and I am lost for words, so lost in love I am, sweetly broken, holy surrender. In all of the cross I must confess how wondrous your redeeming love, and how great is your faithfulness. And at the cross you beckon me, draw me gently to my knees, and I am lost for words, so lost in love I am, sweetly broken, holy surrender. And at the cross you beckon me, you draw me gently to my knees, and I am lost for words, so lost in love I am, sweetly broken, holy surrender. Lost for lost in love. I am sweetly broken, holy surrender. Lost for words, so lost in love. I'm sweetly broken, holy surrender. There's nothing worth more that could ever come close. Nothing can compare. You're our living hope. Your presence, Lord. I've tasted and seen of the sweetest of loves, where my heart becomes free nothing worth more that could ever come close. Nothing can compare. You're our living hope. Your presence, Lord. Your presence, Lord. Ooh, your presence, Lord.
Today's message, Don't Settle, is a challenge for all you Christians. It's a challenge for you who go to church. It's a challenge for you to sort of rethink what it means to follow Jesus. And when I say that, I'm not just speaking to people who are followers. And if you've tuned in and you're just checking this out and you're not a church person, you're not a Christian, I just want to start by saying becoming a Christian is easy. Becoming a Christian is easy because the price is paid. Jesus paid for the debt of our sin on a cross. We've heard that and we've understood that. But here's the problem. When we read the Gospels and the letters that were written by Peter, Paul, James, Jude, John, when we read their letters, there's never a point when these first century Christians are really even calling themselves Christian, which would mean one associated with Christ, a Christ one. And in fact, there's only 3 times in the New Testament where the word Christian is used. And the first time is when Luke uses the word in the city of Antioch. And in this particular text in Acts, it says this. It says, the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. And to some degree, Luke is sort of defining what Christian means. And Christian was an outsider term. It was something that was used by people who were not Christian. It was actually a derogatory term. But in this particular case, Luke says to us, the disciples, and he wasn't just talking about the 12. At this point, there were thousands who were identifying with Jesus Christ, who were followers of Jesus Christ. A disciple equals a follower. And so this early movement, in fact, early on it was called a Nazarene sect because Jesus was from Nazareth. And in fact, it was also called the Way. And when Saul actually, his original name, when he started persecuting Christians, what we see in the scriptures is that there's this picture of outside labels, the Nazarene sect, the Way, Christians that are put on the followers of Jesus. But here's the deal. The real question is not, are you a Christian? The real question is not, am I a Christian? But are you a Jesus follower? That's the real question. The real question is, are you a disciple of Jesus Christ? Are you a follower of the way, the truth, and the life? And are you more than just simply a Christian? Because if you're a Christian, you may be thinking that following Jesus' example is just being a good example. It's not really following in his footsteps. But the problem with the word Christian is that we can define and redefine the word Christian, and we can do it until we feel fine about how we stand inside of it, because there isn't a real firm definition for Christian. But there is a very firm definition for being a follower, because when we follow Jesus, Jesus said, if anyone wants to come after me, he needs to deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. There's a cost to following Jesus, and the people that pay the highest cost make the greatest impact. And what Jesus was calling people to do, sort of like John did in the prelim, he was calling people to repent, to change the direction of their lives, to live their life in a different direction. That's what Jesus was doing. He was calling us to live a countercultural life in his countercultural kingdom. He was calling us to live life in a different direction than culture would take us, to sort of an upside down movement. And in his most famous sermon, which we all know as the Sermon on the Mount, which is probably his best quoted sermon, but least applied, he says this. It says that now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountainside and sat down. So he had just been healing people. He had been delivering people from demons. And it says that he had this crowd follow him, and he went and sat down. And it says his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. And this moment must have been amazing. It must have been amazing. Can you imagine yourself at the Sermon on the Mount? I mean, we gather for great events. We gather for concerts. And I can remember one of the greatest events that I ever saw was when I was a junior in high school, and I witnessed what's known as the Immaculate Reception in Three Rivers Stadium, the original Three Rivers Stadium, when the Steelers were playing the Oakland Raiders, and they're playing the Raiders, and the Raiders go ahead with 30 seconds left, and all of a sudden it looks like Pittsburgh is still going to live in futility. They've been in futility in football for 40 years, but all of a sudden, an amazing thing happens, and a ball bounces off the head of Jack Tatum, and it gets picked up by Franco Harris, and he runs a touchdown, and all of a sudden, the Steelers have won the divisional playoff game. And within the next 10 years, they would win 4 Super Bowl titles, and eventually 6, and eventually having been in 8 Super Bowls. But what I'm saying in that is this event, this Sermon on the Mount, would have been way greater than that. I mean, this was the Creator who was the speaker. This was the Word made flesh, according to John. This was God in a body. This was the person who John describes as being full of grace and truth. This was the event. And it says that when Jesus was finished saying these amazing things he said, and he said some things that were amazing, like, well, he said, you know what? You've heard it said, love your neighbors. But I say to you, love your enemies. You've heard it was said that you need to do this, but I say do that. And he went back and forth. He said that you need to turn the other cheek. You need to be able, when someone says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, not so with you. And he gives this amazing back and forth sermon in which he's basically saying that if you love God, then you need to demonstrate that love and authenticate that love by loving others. And not just others that you know, not just others that you even just don't know, but even your enemies, even people who have taken something from you or offended you. And it says that when Jesus finished this sermon, and the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he had taught as one with authority and not as their teachers of the law. It says that Jesus comes down the mountain, and this large crowd is still following. I mean, now they're really excited. Now they're ready to super celebrate. And it says that Jesus basically dropped this mic, goes down the mountainside, and then he runs into somebody. And here's who he runs into. It says a man with leprosy, a leper, came and knelt before him, and he said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus, and you got to understand, lepers were the most outcast of all outcasts. And this guy's actually coming to Jesus, asking for him to heal him. And Jesus does something that's unthinkable. He reaches out and he touches the leper. He touches him and he says, I am willing, be clean. And immediately he's cleansed of his leprosy. And so on the verge of that, now everybody's saying, he not only says amazing things, he does amazing things. I mean, this Jesus, he's the real deal. He not only talks the talk, but he walks the talk. And the next thing that happens is something that reminds me of what I would call a lights come on in the basement experience. And you might say, what is that, Coach? And I can just tell you, when I was in high school, I had a girlfriend. And she was a head cheerleader. And I was the captain of the football team and the captain of the wrestling team. And I would go over to her house, and she had this finished basement, or their family had this finished basement. And we would go down there to hang out. And sometimes we would turn the lights down a little bit. I'm not sure what for, but we would turn the lights down. And I'll never forget the day that her father, who was not a large man, he had been a wrestler. He was a lightweight. He was a 118-pounder in college. And he comes down the steps. But he didn't turn the lights on till he got to the bottom. I don't know if they had 2 switches or what the case was, but he comes to the bottom of the steps and he turns the lights on. And when something like that happens, you're not asking, how do you feel in that moment? You're saying, what happened next? In other words, we've all felt that moment, haven't we? I mean, we've sort of all been there in one way, shape, or another. Maybe it wasn't a lights on in the basement exactly, but it was a lights on in the basement type experience where someone caught you and the light went on. And what are you going to do? And the real question is not whether you feel bad, but what happens next? And so what changed the mood and the celebration that was happening after this amazing message at the Sermon on the Mount, and after this amazing healing of a leper took place, is that as Jesus enters Capernaum, Capernaum is sort of his rest stop. It's where he always got his battery recharged. He would go to Peter's house and have lunch. He would go hang out there. And as he was entering Capernaum, it says this. It says that when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant is paralyzed, suffering terribly. And we might not think much of that when we read it and say, okay, just another guy come asking for healing, and this time is for his servant. But the reality of the matter is, this was an outsider. This was a way outsider. This was a Roman soldier. This was the Romans who had oppressed the Jews. And in this particular moment and time, the entire crowd is standing there with their jaw dropped saying, can you believe that this Roman soldier, who doesn't even live near here, he would not have been from Galilee, he would have been from outside Galilee, he's actually come here, and he's asking Jesus to heal his servant. And this is like an enemy asking for healing. And we've sort of all been there when someone comes to us and asks us for a second chance. Or maybe it's a third chance. And we're thinking, why would we even begin to consider doing that? And you know what? This directly connects. This helping strangers is easy, but helping somebody who has taken something from you, someone who has hurt you, someone who you would consider your enemy, helping them, I mean, that is just a countercultural, counterintuitive move. But if you remember in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he had said this. He had said, and if you do good for those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. In other words, Jesus said, you need to be willing to help the one who's not your friend, not just somebody you don't know, somebody you don't like, somebody who you have something ought against. You know, that's the kind of love that Jesus was looking for us to demonstrate. And in this lights on in the basement moment, what does Jesus do? What does he do with this amazing request? Here's what happened. Jesus said to him, shall I come and heal him? In other words, can I come to your house and heal him? As a Roman, the centurion replied, no, Lord, I don't deserve to have you under my roof. You know, you don't even have to come. Jesus, I know you're willing to come here, and I know that's amazing, but you don't even have to come. Just say the word. My servant will be healed. Just say the word, Jesus. That's what he says. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. I don't deserve you coming into my house. The next thing that happens is this Roman centurion defines how he sees Jesus. And he says this. He says, for I myself am a man under authority. And when soldiers under me, I tell this one go, and he goes. I tell that one come, and he comes. I mean, I've got authority, Jesus. I've got people that report to me. And when Jesus heard this, he was amazed. And what was he amazed at? He was amazed at the faith of this centurion. In fact, he actually said next, there's not faith like this anywhere in Israel. Even amongst the Jews who are my people, they don't have faith like you. And you're an outsider. You're a Roman. And so Jesus was complimenting him on having such great faith. And then he turns and he says this. He says, then Jesus said to the centurion, go, let it be done just as you believed it would. I'm saying the word. Let it be done. And immediately the servant is healed. And suddenly the crowd realizes that Jesus actually meant what he said when he said, love your enemies. Do good for those who've despitefully used you. Go the extra mile. They just weren't hashtags. They just weren't one-liners that Jesus was using. And that's why it's easier to be a Christian than a Jesus follower. It's easier to say, I'm a believer, I'm a Christian, than to actually follow Jesus. And because in this moment and in this time, you can see that Jesus was doing what he said. He was actually living out what he had spoken in his Sermon on the Mount. Because it's easier to do good for a stranger. It's easier to do good for a stranger than someone who's offended you, someone who's taken something from you, who you would sort of consider to be your enemy. And because it's way easier, if you think about it, it's way easier to love people who look like you, who think like you, who live like you, and who agree with you. It's way easier to love people who are like you than people who are not like you. And what Jesus was doing here was he was demonstrating his love with someone who was nothing like him. This Roman centurion was really nothing like Jesus, but Jesus liked him. And the centurion liked him back. And it's just sort of an underscore to the fact that it's way easier to be seated in a crowd of spectators. It's way easier to go to church and just sit in as a spectator in the stands, as a consumer on Sunday, but to never really do anything. To be someone who's there and is hearing what is said, but not actually getting on the playing field and being a disciple, being a follower. Because, you know what, if Christian is what you choose to be, if you settle for Christian, and I'm saying to you today, if you have settled for Christian, don't settle for Christian. You'll contribute to the problems that are in the world. In other words, the things you're watching on TV, these terrible things that are happening, you know, you become a part of them if you're not willing to do something about them. Because simply believe is not enough. It's not enough to simply believe. What we have to do is we have to actually act. Because if you simply believe, you will not act. In fact, you will not react when you see something that is wrong, when you see an injustice. And you'll just be content to know, but not to actually do. You'll be content to sit back, to sit in the stands at church and to go home on Sunday. And that's why being a follower, being a disciple of Jesus is way more than a Sunday experience. It's way more than just sitting and listening. It's way more than having a degree. It's way more than learning or knowing. You become, if you become that, what Jesus called a hearer and not a doer in the concluding statement of his Sermon on the Mount. And here's what he said. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them to practice, does not do them, is like a foolish man. He's like a fool who built his house on sand. He built his life on sand. The rains came, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. And life does happen and will beat against our houses. And this house fell. And it fell with a great crash because it was not built on the right thing. That's why when Jesus commissioned us to go and make disciples, and he said to teach them to obey, he didn't just say teach them. He didn't just say make sure they learn a few things. He said make sure they are doers. Make sure they are obedient to what I have said. And these everyone's in this story. Perhaps they're like the Christians that sometimes can fool themselves into thinking they have favor with God, but they really don't. And that's what was happening in this case. And the men and women in the world who make the most difference are not the men and the women in the world who simply believe. It's the men and women in the world who actually do something, who actually take their faith and put it to practice, like we're seeing Jesus do in this story from Matthew. It's the people who don't settle for Christian, but become followers of Jesus Christ, to become his disciples, that actually do what Jesus said, and they don't just learn, they're not just taught, but they obey what they hear. And I think Paul concludes this best in his letter to the Romans when he says this, you see, at just the right time, at the perfect time, when we were still powerless, meaning we could not do anything that would overcome the sin that was in us, Christ died for the ungodly. He died for sinners. And it says that, but God demonstrated, he proved his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, while we were still like the centurion, offenders, enemies, Christ died for us. The statement that I'm a Christian is great, but are you a follower? And because, like I said, originally the word Christian was a derogatory term. It was an outsider term thrown against insiders. But right now, are you just a Christian or are you a follower of Jesus? You see, because it won't cost you anything to be a Christian. but it could cost you everything to be a follower. And I think in concluding, I just want to say this, that I decided to follow Jesus. In 1974, in the university dormitory at Cornell, in the West Campus, in the very first month that I was there, I made a decision to follow. I believed that Jesus had died for my sin. And so that's true. I confessed that I was a sinner and that I wanted to follow him. But it's been the following that's made all the difference, not just the original accepting his salvation in my life, because that cost me nothing, but following will cost you everything. And with that in mind, I want to end today's live stream with a song that Tyler and Hannah are going to sing to you. And it's an interesting song. It's a song that really started my Christian walk. It was one of the first songs I learned. When I was a Christian in the mid-70s, I learned this song called I Have Decided to Follow Jesus. And when I say that, some of you may recognize it, and some of you say, what is that? But the song is very interesting because it's approximately 120 years old. And it was actually a song that was given to a missionary who was sent out of the Welsh revival in the early 1900s to northeast India, to a region called Aslam. And in this region, in this primitive region, where there were headhunters, it was sort of a graveyard for missionaries. This missionary took his wife and 2 kids. He took his family, and he landed there and began to connect with these people. And as he connected with these people in this region, some of them began to become Jesus followers. And when that happened, the chief was not happy. And he called the whole village together, and he brought this family, this missionary, his wife and his 2 kids in front of him. He said, you need to denounce your faith in Jesus Christ right now, publicly, or otherwise I'm going to have your 2 children put to death by arrow. And in this moment, in this time, this guy is given, in a sense, what we would call a spiritual song, a song given to him by the Holy Spirit. And he begins to say and sing this. He begins to sing, I have decided to follow Jesus, no turning back. And his children were arrowed down. And after that happened, the village chief turns to him and said, now you know I'm serious. You see what you just did by not denying your faith. Now your wife is standing here, and I'll do the same to her if you don't deny your faith. And this missionary stood before the chief, and he said, though none go with me, still I will follow. Though none go with me, still I will follow. This was a song that God was giving him in the moment. And then the chief is further enraged, and he has his wife arrowed down. And then following that, he says, this is your last chance. Obviously, you're next. Obviously, I'll do it. And so you need to denounce your faith in Jesus right now in front of this entire village, or otherwise you're going to go to your death. You're going to go to your grave just like your 2 children and just like your wife. And he turns and says, the cross before me, the world behind me. And the chief has him arrowed down. And in the midst of this, the chief is stunned that they gave up their lives, that this missionary gave his life up for someone who had lived 1900 years earlier, Jesus Christ. And he was so profoundly impacted by that he said, you know what? I have to follow this Jesus. I too now belong to Jesus. And what happened from that is a movement started, and the entire village became followers of Jesus. And that's sort of the history behind the song that you're going to listen to right now. And as you listen to it, I would just like to challenge you to ask yourself, have I decided to follow Jesus? Or am I just a churchgoer? Or am I just a Christian? And if I can't say that I've decided to follow, maybe today is the day for you to decide to follow Jesus. Maybe even during this song, as you listen to the words, you can make that decision that I made in a college dormitory on Cornell's West Campus in 1974 when I decided to follow Jesus. You can do that today. But if you've made that decision, and maybe you've decided and undecided, or maybe you've decided and you've gotten off track, and you feel like I need to redecide, I need to rededicate myself to follow Jesus. If that's you today, I would also encourage you to take that step and to make that statement before God and Jesus, to just turn to him and pray and say, Lord, I give you my life. Lord, I want to follow you. And if you've never followed and you're listening to this, I would just encourage you to consider following Jesus. And so here's the song. And at the end of the song, you're going to see a message come up that'll give you my cell phone that you can text to. And if you've made the decision to follow Jesus, I would love to know about that. I would love to actually have some conversation with you. So please, please, if you're redeciding to follow, or if you're deciding, if you've gotten off course, text me and let me know.
I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided